And today we're focusing on heritage as a value in crisis situations. So as a quick overview, when there is a crisis situation, be that emerging from war, revolution or violent conflict, it does elicit the problem of addressing urban heritage as part of the recovery and reconciliation. And then the broader question of who has the legitimacy to make these decisions. And one of the objectives of our research network is to consider the different values that people may have in these types of situations. And as you're aware, heritage is a value-laden term, and it means that this decision-making process is contentious. So my own PhD actually focused on the demolition and adaptation of existing buildings, but very much in a non-conflict or disaster context. And even there, as I'm sure many of you would have witnessed, that different stakeholders have different attitudes and agendas towards these decisions, and this includes the interpretation of heritage and what's important to keep. And so, as I'm sure will be reflected in the talks that are about to come, the contentious nature of these decisions is exacerbated, and determining whose heritage we're talking about, in crisis situations is very much exacerbated. And so the talks today explore this concept of heritage as a value in 3 geographical contexts. So that's going to be in Tunisia, Lebanon and Syria. And I'm really pleased to welcome our 3 really fantastic speakers. So we've got Dena Qaddumi, Yasmina Chami and Ammar Azzouz. And we'll have the 3 presentations, which will last about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we'll open up the floor to questions. So either raise your hand and ask it or type it in the chat, but we'll get back to that at the end. And another one of the aims of our network is to embrace interdisciplinarity. So it'll be great to hear from you, whatever your professional academic expertise is. Just as a housekeeping note, the talks are being recorded, but the questions and discussions will not be. And during the presentations, if you're happy to, please have your videos on so that the speakers can see the audience. And so our first speaker is going to be Dena Qaddumi. So Dena recently completed her PhD research on the materialization of revolution in Tunis at the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge. And she's worked in architecture, planning and higher education in New York, London, Palestine and Doha. And her research interests span post-colonial urbanism, architectural studies and political geography. So I will hand over to you now, Dena, if you start sharing.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me just set this up. Great. Is that all good?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, looks like I can't see anyone anymore, but that's fine. I'll just talk to.
We're here.
I don't know why it did that. All right, that's fine. So I'll be talking today about parts of my PhD research. The research itself looked more generally on how revolution is materialized in Tunis. But when I started the research, this was, almost 5 years ago, it became apparent that heritage was a main kind of source of contention through revolution in the city. Sorry. So I just wanted to start, we were really lucky at Cambridge because we do have a research center that does focus on heritage. And I was very fortunate because in my first year, they actually had a seminar or a full day symposium on heritage and revolution that I got to participate in. And while heritage and revolution is a established research topic, and heritage in the city is similarly an established research topic, bringing heritage, revolution, and the city together is something that isn't completely worked out. And I'm interested to see what Ammar brings in from Syria moving forward. But that was, a challenge I kind of had in this project. So today I just want to kind of cover 5 main, we could call them taxonomies of revolutionary heritage or urban heritage, and how I saw them in my research happening. So the first is heritage of the revolutionary event. And by that, I mean the actual protests, and demonstrations and sort of confrontations between the people and the regime that happened, and what people would normally call revolution, and today I'll calling it the revolutionary event. The second kind of side of contestation are those pieces of architecture or archaeology that are already considered kind of formal heritage. And today I'll be talking about the Islamic city, the Medina, and Carthage as an archaeological site. The third is, as revolution progresses, ideas about who are the new people to emerge from revolution begin to kind of come up. And this is a source of conflict between different social groups. And this, leads to discussions about, who was the revolution for, reconsidering history, who's part of national history, and then therefore heritage. So it's a very strange connection of past, present, and the future coming together. The fourth is what to do with those pieces of architecture that the regime occupied and that they built. So obviously revolution comes in response to something, and now we have those objects, and what are we going to do with them in the city? And then the fifth is actually rethinking what we mean by the word heritage and its location in the city, and what sites are actually heritage sites. So I'll kind of quickly go through examples of these in my site, which is Tunis. Before I do that, I just want to give you a sense of the city. So Tunis, and I hope you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, but historically emerged, Carthage is on the northeast side of the city. And of course, it's an ancient site. And then the Islamic Medina was first built in the 7th century and expanded all through different kind of empires up through Ottoman, or part of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. And then with French colonialism expanded. And the French colonization of Tunisia began in 1881, and a new city was built just to the east of the Medina, which is this area here, and it had expanded over the centuries. And you can kind of see the French colonial city is a very different urban fabric, and it expanded on either side of the Medina. And then Tunisia gained independence in 1956, and from that, we would just have a massive growth of the city. Here's the Medina, here's Carthage, and you can see the city is just massive. It's the capital city, obviously, of the country. It's 2.5 million people, the greater Tunis area. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we say the city. So the first bit I want to talk about is the heritage of the revolutionary event. So the former dictator of Tunisia, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, kind of abdicated his pseudo throne on 14th of January 2011. And on that day, there were main protests in Avenue Bourguiba in central Tunis. And what I just want to say quickly about this site is it's become a site where you commemorate that day and that event that happened through protests. So every 14th of January, there's some kind of event that happens in this site. But beyond just the commemoration of the event, the site becomes the place through which to expand revolutionary demands. So it's a site, I think this lower picture on the right was just taken this week against police brutality. And that kind of language of being in the site in order to expand political demands has to happen in Avenue Bourguiba today. That's where different actors come to exercise this kind of legitimacy, not just through protest, but through other types of activities. And so it's a direct site of confrontation, continued confrontation between people and regime, even 10 years on from the revolutionary event. The next kind of site is these formal heritage sites. So this is an image of the main gate into the Islamic old city, basically. And before 2011, these sites tended to be, they were quite, let's say, mismanaged by the old regime in certain ways. There were accusations that They had stolen some of the archaeological artifacts. The former mayor went to jail for this. People within the National Heritage Institute also went to jail for this. And this site, when the absence of these old regime figures, the site became open for the expansion of different actors to do different types of activities. And so here I'm just showing you one particular organization, l'ARUP. They do different types of activities in public space, and they use this gate of the sea to do such activities. The artwork on the left is a kind of remark on the state of heritage in the country and how it's enclosed by barbed wire and very kind of encased and mummified. And then on the upper right, they do kind of dance performances in front of this gate, even in the presence of kind of major police and security. In the bottom right, it was an old garbage kind of dump in the Medina streets, and they kind of cleaned it up and made it a new kind of urban park. And the idea that I just want to convey is that in this new political instability, you have a regime that's very weak, and you have actors that have the audacity to go into different spaces and do different types of creative activities. Often, different actors reinforce each other's activities and work together. And the new regime is sort of in a space where they have to follow along, and they don't have, kind of a choice in the matter, and they just sort of allow these activities to continue. That's not to say that these actors are brand new to the site. So a site like the Medina has a very tight-knit social fabric. And so these actors have been working in the site for a while, but it's through revolution that new potentials to do different types of activities in different spaces emerges. So another site is actually the archaeological site of Carthage, which is kind of the different sites of Carthage are within the current city, and it's hard to know where one ends and one begins. If anyone's been there, you've probably gotten a sense of that. So after 2011, there were efforts by kind of architectural preservationists and so on to really implement a plan to kind of save Carthage finally, now that the regime was not there to kind of take advantage and steal parts of the kind of archaeological sites. And there's a whole court case ongoing with that and so on. But at the moment that these kind of architects and urbanists and archaeologists were doing, this campaign, you also had a situation where people who lived near, it was the old circus of Carthage, in this kind of unstable political environment, they had started to expand their homes and build kind of, new structures on these old sites. And so the new regime is trying to, prevent them from, or trying to get them off of these sites now. And so there's sort of a tension between preserving this heritage and then also these groups kind of saying, well, no one's using these sites anyway. They weren't well kept. In fact, the old regime was taking advantage of these sites. We're the urban poor. Why can't we use these sites? And they feel like they're being discriminated against, that the old regime had free reign to do whatever they wanted. And then as soon as they, try to just use these sites just for basic kind of needs, that they're being prevented to do so. And so the point that I want to make here is that, this situation, revolution has kind of opened up a new avenue of contestation between the preservationists and also the urban poor on who gets to use these sites and what's the use value of an archaeological site. So the next is this idea of what is national heritage and who are the people. And so in 2012, 2013, there was unfortunately, a lot of destruction by quote unquote radical Islamic groups in Tunisia of zawiyas, which are kind of mostly Sufi shrines and praying areas, and oftentimes community spaces. and particularly in 2013, I believe it was 2013, the main Zawiya in Sidi Bou Said, which is a small suburb of Tunis, was vandalized. And so this brought, to public discourse, what is the role of Sufism in Tunisian national identity? What type of Islam is part of Tunisian national identity? And there was a lot of, is it a religious identity? Is it a cultural identity? And so on. And so the point that I want to make here is that you have, existing kind of religious sites that become implicated very quickly in how they define who the people are. And just the picture on the right is just sort of a typical kind of Sufi performance that happens in public space in Sidi Bou Said, now sort of in defiance of this vandalism that had happened to the Zawiya nearby. Another thing that came up that was quite interesting was a revival of Ottoman kind of modern heritage. And this happened in multiple forums, but one of the main ones was the reopening of this building on the right, which had been an Ottoman palace. And actually a private philanthropist had kind of really pushed the government to open up the site, and she and her institution had actually provided the funding to have a major exhibition in the site. And so again, rethinking how does Ottoman history enter into present Tunisian ideas of identity, and is it Arab, or is it Ottoman, or is it Muslim, and so on. And so a lot of the Ottoman kind of period had been kind of put away by the old regime and not celebrated in public space. And this is kind of a new phenomenon, almost a fetishization of the Ottoman period and how it was also a modern period. So briefly, and I'm running out of time. This was a building, this is Ben Ali, the former president of Tunisia. And behind him in this image is a tower that he had commissioned to be the headquarters of his political party, which was sort of the only political party, really, let's say, substantial political party in Tunisia prior to 2011. And so today, the building has been renamed to the Tower of the Nation. It now holds the Ministry of State Property, and the state is currently trying to figure out what to do with this tower, now that it owns it after 2011. I'll just be one more minute. So this one is about expanding heritage sites. And so this organization, they're called Where is the Heritage? They're, a bunch of kind of young architects who are trying to redefine what is heritage in post-2011 Tunisia. And so for them, they're trying to get the state to think about heritage not only as these very kind of old medieval sites, but also either modern sites or even sites that wouldn't normally be considered heritage. The site that's highlighted here was a bunker from World War II built in the outskirts of Tunis. And this project is a photography project by someone who engages in urban exploring, and he tries to again show the Medina from very different orientations, and shows how parts of the Medina, it's not just these beautiful picturesque mosaics, but also from different angles you can see the ruins and perspectives and so on. So I'm just going to end. This is an article by Nasser Rabat from 2016 that kind of talked about this revolution as a moment to think that we can have a right to heritage, and that there's new discourse on what heritage is, and that revolution enabled that to happen. And so I just want to end here and say that hopefully through these 5 things, heritage as a revolutionary, how sites become implicated in heritage and revolution in Tunis. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. It was very disorienting not seeing anyone. So I was a bit talking to no one in the room.
Well, it's fantastic nonetheless. So, but yeah, thank you so much. And I think definitely Yasmina's and Ammar's talks are going to follow on that from really nicely, because in our pre-panel chat, we talked about whose heritage is it, and particularly what you were saying about Ottoman history entering into the present, and then also that map at the end about potentially the everyday heritage. I'm sure some of the things which are going to come up in the following talks. But yeah, I will now go over to Yasmina. So as a bit of an introduction, she is an architect and a final year PhD candidate in the Centre for Urban Conflicts Research at Cambridge, and her work examines the intersections of colonial and imperial histories with the production of architecture and the built environment. Her doctoral dissertation explores the role of competing missionary educational institutions in the 19th century urbanism of Beirut. And I do also just want to have give an extra thank you to Yasmina for agreeing to speak, because she is in the final stages of writing up. So yeah, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. And yeah, I mean, just a note to say that actually my PhD is not on post-war reconstruction, but this is what I'm going to be talking about. And yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see where the conversation goes, because I think that, as you'll see, the way that I'm approaching heritage is slightly different from Dena's presentation. So I'm just going to share. So is it like, can you see my?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. Okay. Do you see the whole thing? Because I can see you on the right hand.
Yes, and your name at the bottom. Yeah.
Okay. So almost a year ago, on the 4th of August, 2020, an enormous explosion at the port of Beirut shook the city, shattering buildings and homes around 3-kilometer radius and more, causing a huge amount of destruction across wide parts of the city, and of course also a lot of death and damage all around. But in the aftermath of this catastrophic event, the immediate need was to first, sweep the streets from the mass of the broken glass, which was everywhere, and then immediately after to consider how to reconstruct the huge amounts of homes that were destroyed. Now, this was even more dramatic and complicated, given that the country had been in a huge financial crisis, effectively crippling the entire economy since October 2019, and that nobody had access to their funds, which have been blocked in the banks since October 2019. So besides kind of highlighting the extent of the current government's impotency and criminality, what the blast and the aftermath showed is how the question of heritage is always exacerbated by political crises, as you were saying, especially in Lebanon. So the destruction, it caused widespread distress, but it was also followed by a large number of civil society groups that were either created or sprang up to sort of respond to the need that was created from the blast, to help citizens recover their homes and to rebuild some form of shelter. Kind of unique showcase of civil society solidarity and the power of grassroots movements. So several NGOs were organized in addition to sort of urban research labs and associations and heritage associations, and they pulled together to distribute aids and funds to organize the cleaning, the rebuilding, etc., because the state has until now been completely uninvolved. But in many ways, this was not only because of the need for recovering these houses, but I think also because in many ways the destruction caused fears and memories of the disappearance of heritage in Lebanon, fears that sort of linger in Lebanese collective memory ever since the reconstruction of Beirut during and after the Lebanese Civil War. So in reality, even before the blast, heritage in Lebanon had been under constant threat. And the neighborhoods most affected by the blast, which were in the east of the city, were already under threat of being gentrified or being replaced by sort of new neoliberal real estate investments, or just being left to ruin, like this mansion, for example. So in this talk, I want to suggest that the crisis of heritage in Beirut today runs deeper than a simple crisis of neoliberal heritage capital or a neglect of architecture's value. What we continue to face in Lebanon today is a crisis of political, economic, and social identity, and one of sovereignty. And I want to quickly revisit
Yasmina, just
Yeah.
to interrupt slightly, I think you're occasionally knocking your mic and it's going in and out. Have you got earphones in and a microphone?
I have earphones, but I don't have a microphone.
Oh, okay, no, well, carry on. It's just only occasionally it's cutting out, but I didn't know if it was a microphone. But carry on, we can hear most of it. It was just a tiny bit.
It's probably
okay.
the papers. Just be careful with the paper and the
Yeah, if you're
Oh, I
moving
see.
paper, maybe, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Carry on.
Yeah. So I want to quickly in this talk revisit the issues with the notion of heritage since and after Solidaire, so the reconstruction, which I think continued to sort of impact many of our current debates about heritage in Beirut. So when heritage is invoked today in Lebanon, it most often refers to a traditional domestic typology, which was prevalent in the 19th century, which is called the Central Hall House, which you see here destroyed. But the Central Hall type itself belongs to a history of imperial, contestation that is in dire need of further excavation and questioning in itself. So the traditional Central Hall House is an Ottoman typology, which was elaborated in the 19th century as a response to the growth of Beirut as a merchant city. So it emblematized both this political raison d'etre for the city before it was even the capital of the nation state today called Lebanon. And it represented a new bourgeois class of citizens which were engaging in these practices. So it combined an Ottoman 9-square grid and Levantine arched windows and French imported roof tiles, as well as Italian marble. So it combined kind of a variety of influences, as well as the specific history of the city at the time. But it was also sort of paradigmatic of the finely calibrated relationship between private and public spheres in this period. And it embodied the sort of familial and patrimonial structure of Arab Ottoman society. So the Ottoman Central Hall House, it evolved from the sort of Arab courtyard house, which you see here, which also was reflected in the structure of the city itself. And then, so you see here the transformation of the city together with the transformation of the types making up the city. And so until the late 19th century, the city was kind of very reflective of, the family being the core, the organizing core of society. And this was changed after 1920 with the French Mandate, which sort of restructured the city along these huge, very French Beaux-Arts monumental lines. But along with that transformation, the Central Hall was sort of expanded, but it kept the scalar idea of the original type, but it was kind of made bigger in order to accommodate the new idea of the city under the French Mandate, which was that it was now to be a sort of administrative capital city for a new republic. The Civil War left large parts of the city destroyed and culminated in the complete expropriation of the city center by a real estate company newly created by the government and Rafiq Hariri, who was at the time the prime minister, called Solidaire. And Solidaire was basically given extraordinary powers of expropriation. But at the end of the civil war, large parts of the city were still kind of there. They were just destroyed. So Solidaire's strategy was to privilege certain buildings as heritage, while allowing the complete destruction of large urban areas of the city center. And so what was retained was not a dynamic understanding of heritage or of the past, or a sort of, a real representation of the long multi-layered history of the city, but specific instances of its past, and especially the French Mandate era buildings around the immediate core. And even these few buildings that were retained were reduced to a facade hiding open building plans to comply with the generic office requirements and corporate needs of Solidaire. So what Solidaire did was to basically destroy everything behind these facades and rebuild an image of an old city without really engaging with what these buildings used to house in terms of programs, who used to live there, what were the historic and economic political history of the city. So the master plan not only dispossessed the residents of Beirut, which anyway had been driven out by the war, but it completely restructured the scale and the character of the urban realm of the city by transforming basically a type that had grown organically into an image of heritage, albeit one that didn't really reflect on its provenance and legacy, right? So when we're choosing to sort of value the French Mandate era buildings, what does that really mean about this new city center? But as I sort of showed in the previous drawing, both in the late Ottoman and the French Mandate period, there was still a sort of basic scalar characteristic to the way that the urban plan or the urban fabric of the city had been organized or transformed through this idea of the central hall type. And so, you could think of the transformation of the city prior to the Civil War as a sort of scalar transformation from the scale of the house to the block, to the neighborhood, to the city, and ultimately, to the nation, which was at that point, a collection of provinces before the creation of the Lebanese state. But in the Solidaire master plan, the city had lost these scalar relationships between the individual and society, architecture, and the urban. The master plan essentially laid out a detailed zoning plan for the entire city, while claiming to be built on the remains of the old one. But it was also designed as a series of intentional urban gestures and compositions, the references of which were not anything that had to do with the specific socioeconomic character of the city, but really this real estate company and its vision for what the city center should become. And so you can see here how the scalar transformations impacted the urban fabric of the city, and how the consolidation of plots between the old center and Solidaire's master plan effectively precludes the reconstruction of the city according to an urban scale that preserves any sort of semblance of urban life, or any kind of relationship to the older relationship that used to exist between living and working, or living and the economy, etc. So the master plan's morphological and typological scale departed completely from the previous urban fabric of the city. And instead, what was proposed in Solidaire Center was an architecture that relied on the facade as a container and an image of heritage, with a little connection between the scale of its architectural organization and that of the city. And so what Solidaire ultimately failed to do, in my opinion, after the war, was to understand the significance of architectural space in the articulation not only of an urban realm, but really of a sustainable political economic vision and identity for the city, right? As well as for the capital. And so, in other words, and it failed to propose a much needed socio-political basis on the basis of which the nation could reconstruct itself. And this neoliberal model of heritage, which essentially views it as just an image, is the one that has spread to Ashrafiyeh and to other areas of Beirut in the last decades. And it is the threat of another Solidaire that is gripping architects and urbanists again today. But the superficial treatment of historic types has not been limited to Solidaire's area of operation, and heritage buildings in recent decades have been treated in a similar way across the city and the Lebanese territory. And so this indicates that the predicament facing historic typologies runs deeper than Solidaire's legacy. The reality is that the Central Hall House, which is what we consider our heritage and is a single family bourgeois domestic unit, has long expired as a productive typology. Even when its interiors have been preserved today, its functions have drastically changed, and it is no longer able to contain the contemporary domestic needs and conditions or the realities of the city's transformed economic, raison d'etre and even its political raison d'etre. So where central hall types have been preserved, they've been transformed into boutique hotels, expensive stores, or restaurants and cafes. Because the only sustainable function for these buildings today is as a commercial enterprise, right? In which the historic aspect increases the real estate or entertainment value. But this real estate value is exactly what precludes their survival as anything but an image or a commodity. There is then a real need to question the continued relevance and significance of the central hall type, both as a historically constructed typology loaded with political implications about its own history, and in terms of its ability to sustain contemporary, let alone future possibilities for the city. The old fabric of Beirut and the streets of Mar Mikhael offered some of the last spaces in which heritage was practiced as a lived reality rather than as a memory, in which the scale of the urban, dependent on this historic domestic type, still allowed the kinds of social relationships precluded elsewhere in the city. And this is why there were so many restaurants and bars, etc., that used to their advantage the urban fabric that still remained in these parts. But as the city evolves and our lifestyles evolve, and especially given the ongoing state of crisis which we continuously find ourselves in, I would like to conclude by suggesting that perhaps the biggest predicament of being in a constant state of crisis means that we are always responding emotionally to emergencies, aiming to bring back what was good in the past, and falling prey to nostalgia. And being in a constant state of crisis deprives architects, planners, and citizens from questioning what kinds of relationships we do want to preserve and sustain in our city, to consider the precise way in which architecture forms and urban types allow for such relationships, and to envision new modes of producing them that can also address contemporary architectural, political, and economic exigencies. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think, yeah, really good end note. And we'll just move on to Ammar. But I think one of the things that I picked up is I really like to use the phrase dynamic understanding of heritage and the multi-layered nature of it. And I think he will definitely pick up on some of that as well. But as Ammar's introduction, I need to find it on my screen. So Ammar Azzouz is a London-based architect working at ARUP, and he studied architecture at Al-Baf University in Homs, Syria, before he moved to the UK to complete his PhD at the University of Bath. Ammar has written several articles on Syria, including A Tale of a Syrian City at War, I Can Smell Aleppo, and 2011 Reflections on a Ruined Homeland. And his research interests include urban violence, memory, and domicile. And he's also produced a series of films on these topics. So I'll pass over to you, Ammar, and thank you again to our previous two speakers.
Thanks a lot, Hannah and the team, for putting this together and for giving me the chance to contribute. And thanks for the wonderful scholars and friends, Yasmina and Dena, for the great presentations. I'm going to discuss today the relationship between heritage, power, and politics, with a focus on Syria, where I'm from, where a revolution started over 10 years ago, and over half of the population is displaced. I have very few slides, but I have prepared some text to read. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Cool. So I will start to read now a little bit on the destruction of heritage and how it has been used and abused by international powers. And a faithful copy of ancient Syrian monument destroyed by ISIS, The Guardian arts correspondent Mark Brown wrote in 2016, will stand in central London for 3 days. This was a replica of destroyed Arc of Triumph in Palmyra that stood at the heart of London in Trafalgar Square in front of the National Gallery. The report that Brown, the Guardian journalist, has published was also supplemented with a video of 3D printing and 3D machining as a celebration of advanced techniques. Robots in Italy were used to reconstruct this arch from Egyptian marble. At the unveiling of the arch, which you can see on the screen here, on Tuesday, the 19th of April 2016, Boris Johnson, who was the mayor at the time of London, in the UK, gave a speech which was circulated across mainstream news channels. He said, and I quote, "We are here in the spirit of defiance, who destroyed the original of this arch and destroyed so many other monuments and relics in Syria and in the Middle East and in Palmyra. Congratulations to the Institute of Digital Archaeology. How many digits do you think Daesh deserve? I think 2 digits to Daesh." Whilst he answered his question, Johnson raises his 2 fingers in front of the audience who surrounded the monument. They are the 2 digits that he wants to send to Daesh from the comfort in London. His speech that defines who is the barbarian and who is the protector of archaeology and cultural heritage no doubt has had an impact on the UK's public opinion on the war in Syria and its impact on the destruction and reconstruction of the built environment. But this was not the only time that Johnson has shown an interest in Palmyra. He has written at least 2 pieces about it in March and May, a year before and the year at the time of the revealing of this replica. So it was a perfect timing for the unveiling of the 3D print a month after it, as a promotion to situate it in the public imagination. Both pieces were published at the Telegraph. In one of them, he said, "Bravo, Assad." He added, "The victory of Assad is a victory of archaeology." Johnson said, "We have some of the greatest archaeological experts in the world. I hope that the government will fund them to go to Syria and help the work of restoration," he added. Syria's future will be glorious, but that will be partially dependent on the world's ability to enjoy its glorious past. So this is also a quote. British experts should be at the forefront of the project. However, it wasn't only Johnson who was interested in Palmyra and the cultural heritage sites in Syria. Since the destruction of the ancient site, a huge interest has been directed towards its destruction. Webinars, conferences, NGOs, panel discussions, and papers emerged lamenting the loss of the site and discussing its future. The image of Palmyra has become an image that many international organizations, scholars, and activists will use to talk about culture and violence. But at the same time, they neglected the destruction that happened in other countries, as in a destruction, for instance, in Libya and Yemen and in China. The interest in the ancient, historical, and monumental sites has led to the endless calls to protect the heritage at the time of conflict. But did they actually lead to any protection? Or have they led to the opposite? UNESCO has even called for creating cultural protection islands as in Palmyra. Many read these lines as a way to prioritize protection of stones rather than the people who live in extremis. Professor Lynn Meskel highlights the danger of approaches like the UNESCO, that's suggested by UNESCO. In her excellent book, A Future in Ruins, UNESCO World Heritage and the Dream of Peace, published in 2018, she said, "The danger here is intervening in rescue of purely material heritage, often a classical antiquity, for which Western nations consider themselves to be legitimate inheritors, while not fully addressing those living and dying through the ongoing conflict and the resultant refugee crisis. Western cultural elites have spent more time lamenting the damage to a single site, the classical ruins of Palmyra, than the destruction inflicted on hundreds of Islamic mosques and shrines across Iraq and Syria combined." So just showing here how the heritage is selective, as we have seen in other representation, as we see now in international powers interested in the classical heritage sites and neglecting the other ones. From my exile in Bath in the UK, where I resided at the time, I watched the video of Boris Johnson and the technologies that were used to reconstruct our past. I also read and watched the many events and initiatives on Syria's cultural heritage protection. So much has been done to self-celebrate and self-congratulate the success of such projects to protect my own heritage, whilst at the same time whitewashing the pain of the people. Johnson, who wished for the government to fund the experts, as he terms the experts, has not been done from the reality. In the last decade, different grants have been given to work on Syria more broadly and on cultural heritage sites more specifically. But in many cases, these projects and studies have failed to engage with the Syrian people. For instance, in a paper called Subcontracting Academia, which actually Yasmina has opened my eyes to it, published in 2018, it shows how the academia in the UK is turning our pain into an industry for the people's prestige and success, not for our pain or our damaged lives. In an article, here another example, in an article published by Rowan Moore for The Guardian, titled How Syria's Blasted Landmarks Are Starting to Rise from the Ruins, published in 2020, Rowan Moore, who did not interview any of the tens of charities working inside Syria, rather, he highlights the work of organizations based inside Berlin and Geneva, as if they are the only ones saving our heritage. Another dilemma I have found in his article is the language he uses, for instance, rise from the ruins, when we are in reality living in slow suffering every day. Imagine that half of the UK is, God forbid, imagine that half of the UK's population is forcibly displaced from their home, that third of the housing stock is destroyed, that 80% of the people are living in poverty, that tens of thousands of people are killed and many, many, many are arrested. Then a journalist in Syria writes about what? About Stonehenge rising from the ruins. How would that feel? All this has led me to write a short thread on Twitter that explains how our pain and trauma are turning into a heritage project. So how could our pain is their heritage project? In a viral tweet that has been viewed over 500,000 times and where thousands of people have engaged with, I have written, "As a Syrian in the UK, I have seen how some of the UK's based academics turned our pain and trauma into an opportunity for them, who saw in us a funding opportunity. Many of them wouldn't speak the language, know our struggle, or care about us, but hey, it's good for their career. The use and abuse of Syrian images and heritage, and the use and abuse of the Syrian struggle has often reminded me of Susan Sontag's book regarding the pain of others. I have found it shocking how people had so much confidence to talk about Syria whilst whitewashing our pain and struggle, and reminded me of the words that Susan has wrote in her book, and I quote here. I'm reading now from the quote. "These dead are supremely uninterested in the living, in those who took their lives, in witnesses and in us. Why should they seek our gaze? What would they have to say to us? This we is everyone who has never experienced anything like what they went through, don't understand. We don't get it. We truly cannot imagine what it was like. We cannot imagine how dreadful, how terrifying war is, and how normal it becomes. Cannot understand, cannot imagine." And I think in these words I have really found how many people who wouldn't understand the context of the conflict or the suffering and the struggle we are going through would just jump into a place like Palmyra and talk about it with no politics, with no context, without understanding of the wider struggle that we are going through. Several key messages could be read from the work on Syria's cultural heritage sites that I have observed in the last decade, and from the articles that Boris Johnson published in 2016. I only mentioned two of them. The first is that through the focus on destruction of cultural heritage sites by Islamic states of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a narrative has been constructed on who has been destroying and who has been protecting. Little is mentioned, for instance, on the destruction of the city of Raqqa by the US-led coalition with the UK and French forces. From June, the 6th of June to 17th of October 2017, the forces killed and injured thousands of residents and reduced homes, businesses, and infrastructure to rubble. So what I'm trying to say is, even when we speak about heritage, we are selective to say who is the barbarian, who is the destroyer, who is the killer, and who is not. And in reality, when we are celebrating people achievement of certain governments and countries, they might be destroying other parts, but they are often untalked about. The second point that I wanted to raise, and I hope to finish in the next 1-2 minutes. The second point, which has been the focus of most of my research, is that the focus on the destruction of Syria has often been on celebrity-like heritage sites, rather than the everyday spaces of homes, markets, schools, and squares. This is why in the last few years I started reading about domicide, which is the killing of home, which you can also watch on the videos that Hannah mentioned on YouTube called Cities Don't Lie or Domicide. In my research, I ask, how do we make sense of long-term conflict that radically reshape our cities through slow violence that manifests itself visibly and invisibly in cities, and how can we convert the one-off traumatic rupture of urban systems and the cinematic image of destruction as in Palmyra? How can we transfer that and convert it into an understanding of slow and fast waves of violence that take place in our cities across time? And this is, hopefully I was on time, and thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you, Ammar. You were very much on time. You were under, in fact. So, well, yeah, that was great and very thought-provoking. All three of those, I think, just show the complexity and contentious nature of this topic, including whose decisions these to make, how we define heritage. And what we're going to do now is, if we stop recording,